Autocrats only understand one word, no. They were the words of President Joe Biden as he challenged Vladimir Putin's vision of the war in Ukraine. Standing outside the royal castle in the Polish capital Warsaw, he urged the world's democracies to continue standing up to Russian aggression.
No, you will not take my freedom. No, you will not take my future. A dictator bent on rebuilding an empire will never be able to ease the people's love of liberty. Brutality will never grind down the will of the free. And Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia. Never.
When Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine on the 24th of February last year, neighbouring Poland opened its border to millions of Ukrainians fleeing their country, and Polish people welcomed refugees into their homes. Joe Biden's speech came after that of his Polish counterpart, Andrzej Duda, who addressed the crowd through an interpreter.
This is the role of NATO, to defend the free world, to support the free world. We stand in solidarity with Ukraine, and we will stand in solidarity with Ukraine. There is no freedom without solidarity. Long live free Ukraine. Long live the alliance of the Republic of Poland with the United States. Long live NATO. Long live free world. Long live Poland.
Our correspondent in Warsaw, Adam Easton, told me what it felt like to hear President Biden's speech.
It was a very rousing speech. The emotion in the crowd was palpable. There was lots of cheering and applause, even though the actual content of President Biden's speech wasn't a great deal different from the one he made in almost exactly the same place 11 months ago. But he did speak to several different audiences. He reassured Ukrainians that US support was unwavering. He spoke to his hosts, the Poles, and thanked them, and also told them that the US commitment to NATO is rock solid. So that's very important for people in Poland and the region. And he spoke to Putin, telling him he would fail. And last but not least, he spoke to ordinary Russians, saying that they were not the enemy.
Sounded very defiant, I thought, in tone, perhaps more so than usual. What sort of reaction has he got among Polish people?
His speech and his visit in general, I think, has been very much welcomed and appreciated here in Poland. This visit is unprecedented. It's 2 visits to Warsaw from President Biden in less than a year, fills many Poles with pride, and the sense, as one Polish deputy foreign minister said today, that now the voices of the Central and Eastern European countries are being taken seriously at last. And maybe, even if it is only temporary, there's been a small shift in Europe from west to east in terms of influence.
Adam Easton with me from Poland. Vladimir Putin set the tone earlier on Tuesday during his State of the Nation address in Moscow. He accused Western elites of starting the war to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. President Putin also widened the divide between Russia and the US by announcing the suspension of the last remaining nuclear arms agreement between the two countries. Our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg was following the address in Moscow.
For Vladimir Putin, the invasion of Ukraine has not gone at all according to plan. But remorse? Regret? There's no hint of that. At an exhibition hall by the Kremlin, President Putin took the stage and took aim at the West.
Это они развязали войну.
He repeated the Kremlin's false narrative that Western nations are responsible for the war in Ukraine. They started it, he said. Russia's using force to finish it. There is no sign that Mr. Putin is looking for an off-ramp. Russia suspends its participation in the New START treaty, he announced. New START is the last remaining nuclear arms control treaty between Russia and America. It limits nuclear arsenals and enables on-site inspections of strategic nuclear weapons. Andrei Kolesnikov of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace believes it's a dangerous move by Mr. Putin.
In order to avoid nuclear war, it's better to have a framework. But losing this framework, we are witnessing the real threat of a nuclear war.
But in the hall, Russian parliamentarians and officials were more than happy with what they heard, supportive of a president who favours confrontation over compromise.
China's top diplomat Wang Yi is visiting Russia, where he said that relations between the two countries were rock solid and would withstand any challenges presented by a changing international situation. In Beijing, there's concern the war could spiral out of control. The Chinese President Xi Jinping is expected to make a speech later this week calling for peace in Ukraine. Our correspondent in Beijing is Stephen McDonnell.
The war on the ground may be between Ukraine and Russia, but in China, the war of words is between Beijing and Washington. The Chinese government has consistently blamed the US and its NATO allies for the ongoing conflict. When the flagship television news bulletin here covers the war, the state-controlled outlet routinely says the United States is manipulating events in Ukraine. It never speaks about an invasion and doesn't even call this a war. However, in Beijing today, China's Foreign Minister Qin Gang did predict, rather ominously, that the situation could become much worse. He didn't mention the US, but it was pretty clear who he was talking about. Researchers in America have already accused Xi Jinping's administration of supplying the Russian military with dual-use equipment, like fighter jet parts and jamming technology. The Chinese government has argued that it's neutral, but it's unclear what it might do to prevent a humiliating defeat for Vladimir Putin on the battlefield.
As the first anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine approaches, leaders on both sides of the conflict appear further apart than ever. Our chief international correspondent Lise Doucette is in Kiev and assesses the potential impact inside Ukraine and beyond.
A year ago, President Zelensky warned a war in Ukraine would not stay in Ukraine. Today's rival narratives from Moscow, Warsaw and Beijing have emphasized this yet again. They've also highlighted the continuing concern about an ever more dangerous escalation. President Putin's decision to step away from a nuclear arms control treaty has removed a key pillar in the world's vital security architecture. And today's belligerent tones underline how the divide between world powers grows ever deeper, with both sides now bent on achieving victory, ideally this year. Although here in Ukraine, this still seems like a war without end. The many other countries around the world suffering the consequences of this conflict are watching with alarm. President Biden's comment that this war will define the lives of generations to come underlines how this confrontation in Ukraine will have far-reaching and lasting consequences. And only 1 year into this war, that wider impact is still hard to foresee.
Lise Doucette in Kiev. Genaro Garcia Luna was meant to be fighting Mexico's war on drugs, but the former security chief now faces 10 years to life in prison.
President Biden makes a surprise visit to Kyiv. And how united is NATO's support of Ukraine? This is the State of Ukraine from NPR News. In an unannounced trip, President Biden visited Kyiv to show U.S. support for Ukraine just before the anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion. NPR's Joanna Kakissis was with the president in Kyiv.
Retired banker Nina Albul says she had a feeling something big was going to happen this morning. She noticed the city center in Kyiv was blocked and people were everywhere. She wondered, what's going on?
And then I saw on the news that Joe Biden came here. And I couldn't believe it. I phoned and texted everyone I knew, and I asked, is it true or am I hallucinating?
She says Biden's visit touched her so much she cried.
Our young men and women are fighting to keep Ukraine free. And here is this famous man visiting us in the middle of a war.
A year ago, many predicted Ukraine and its capital would fall to Russia within days. Today, President Biden was in Kyiv, standing side by side with Zelensky.
You and all Ukrainians, Mr. President, remind the world every single day what the meaning of the word courage is.
Biden recalled calling Zelensky the night Russia invaded almost a year ago on February 24th.
You told me that you could hear the explosions in the background. I'll never forget that. And the world was about to change. I remember it vividly. Because I asked you next, I asked you, what is there, Mr. President? What can I do for you? How can I be of help?
Zelensky said, get the world to support Ukraine. Biden says he did just that. And the Western coalition has stuck together.
Putin thought Ukraine was weak and the West was divided. As you know, Mr. President, I said to you in the beginning, he's counting on us not sticking together. He thought he could outlast us. I don't think he's thinking that right now.
Biden said sanctions have weakened the Russian economy and that the U.S. would seek even more of them. And Biden announced that he's seeking another $500 million in aid for Ukraine, something which energized Zelensky.
Such a hefty aid package is an unambiguous signal that Russian attempts to take revenge on Ukraine will be fruitless.
Zelensky also laid out his plan for peace with Russia. It includes giving Ukraine NATO-style security guarantees and forcing Russia to return Ukrainian territory it has taken by force. He suggested Biden likes his plan.
We agree on most points of my peace formula. It's a security imperative to restore the UN Charter and to defend an international order based on human rights.
After their speeches, the two presidents paid tribute at a makeshift memorial to Ukrainians who have been killed fighting Russian forces. The memorial is outside St. Michael's, the golden-domed cathedral that serves as the headquarters of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And as the two presidents walked inside, an air raid siren went off, a sign that Ukraine is still very much a country at war. Joanna Kakissis, NPR News, Kyiv.
In the years since Russia invaded, NATO allies have tried to present a united front. But there have been some big divisions over what weapons to send Ukraine, but also how the conflict should end and what role, if any, Russia should play in a post-war Europe. Here's NPR's Frank Langfitt.
Throughout this war, the core message of NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has been unity. This is how he put it to NPR in an interview in Brussels.
It is in our security interest to support Ukraine. And if you look across the alliance, there's strong continued support on both sides of the Atlantic.
But there are also sharp divisions of opinion on the way forward. For instance, Germany is routinely reluctant to send heavier weapons. Chancellor Olaf Scholz explained his thinking last month to Bloomberg News.
We support Ukraine as long as it is necessary with all the means we can use, but also always avoiding that this war is escalating to a war between Russia and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
NATO allies also have different attitudes towards Russia itself. Late last year, French President Emmanuel Macron said NATO would eventually have to address Russia's security concerns.
This topic will be one of the topics for peace, and therefore it must be prepared. What are we ready to do? How will we protect our allies and member states? By giving guarantees for its own security to Russia the day it returns to the table.
But for NATO allies in Eastern Europe, the notion of making security pledges to a nation that has relentlessly shelled Ukrainian cities is stomach-churning. And for them, it's also personal. They spent decades under Soviet domination. Linus Kojala runs the Eastern Europe Study Center. It's a Lithuanian think tank.
This kind of rhetoric coming from the Western leaders plays into the Kremlin's narrative, because I think Russia launched an invasion of Ukraine not because of NATO, not because of security threats to Russia.
Instead, because Putin wanted to stop Ukraine from drifting out of Russia's orbit and into the embrace of the West.
He clearly stated that there shouldn't be Ukraine as a state because it's simply a part of Russia. So it's not because of NATO, it's because of Russia being an imperialistic power in today's Europe.
Bruno Lettei, a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund in Brussels, says NATO allies are also split on their ultimate goals after the war.
The Nordics, Central and Eastern Europe, want Ukraine to win the war. Those member states that are perhaps a bit more further away from Russia also want Ukraine to win the war, but are probably also interested in some sort of deal, some peace settlement too.
Kristi Reik, deputy director of Estonia's International Center for Defense and Security, says these different approaches are partly a function of distance and history.
Being situated next to Russia, we sense the threat, of course, very clearly. For countries that are geographically more remote, the threat is not existential.
Rake says great power privilege plays a part as well.
France and Germany are used to seeing Russia as one of the major powers in Europe and are used to thinking that in the end, European security matters are settled and decided among the big powers.
But NATO didn't follow that principle after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And some analysts say it failed to take Russia's historical anxieties into account. Zach Pakin is a researcher at the Center for European Policy Studies, a Brussels think tank.
If the United States had not spent the past 8 years, or in fact the past 14 years, openly declaring that Ukraine would become a member of NATO one day, and had the United States not spent the past several years openly talking about Ukraine as if it was a de facto ally already of the United States, I think we wouldn't be here right now.
Pagan says Russia has to be a part of any lasting peace.
One way or another, whether we like it or not, at some point, we will have to address the question of finding an adequate place for Russia in Europe that provides Russia's declared security concerns with a modicum of legitimacy. And if we don't do that, then we're going to be in trouble.
Given Russia's brutality in Ukraine, there is no appetite for a public conversation on this now. And some say, as long as Putin remains in power, there shouldn't be one. Roland Freudenstein heads the Brussels office of the think tank GlobeSec.
I think there will be very, very loud debates in both Germany and France and other West European countries between those who are saying, no, with Putin, we cannot make a deal anymore. And those who say that diplomacy is about talking to people we don't like. I have an impression that probably the people who say no peace with Putin will win the argument.
Managing this question of the future with Russia is the big challenge. For this year, for next year,
Olga Oliker is a top analyst for the International Crisis Group in Brussels.
One vision is the way to make Europe more secure is to weaken Russia as much as possible and build yourself up so that even if they rebuild, they'll still be scared of you.
Oliker says the problem with that tack is Russia's already scared of NATO, and it has nuclear weapons. The other option, she says, is this.
You talk to them, and you figure out ways of limiting activities like exercises, weapons deployments, and so forth that make it harder to start a new war.
As Russia's invasion grinds into its second year, any such negotiations seem a long way off. But officials across Europe are already thinking about them.